Hello everyone, Professor Luck here. So today we're going to continue our discussion about protests as a part of democratic life. Protest movements, how they interact with electoral politics. So when we introduce this idea of protests and when we think about protests, protests are often thought of a normal part of our lives. We see them on TV, we see them on social media. We can't, if there's a large scale protest, we can't avoid it. It is everywhere. Um, so some early scholarship on protests actually argued that protests were thought of as something that happened that wasn't part of quote normal politics at work. But modern scholarship, more recent scholarship, how we talk about interact with politics seems to be that in reality protests are an essential part of how a normal democracy works. Again, when we see them, maybe we're glad our fellow citizens are protesting, demanding changes in the way they see fit. So to us, whether on one side of the political aisle or the other, we probably just accept that, okay, protests are a piece of democracy and probably a useful piece of the democratic system. So when we think of why people protest, it allows citizens to express their voices collectively, to push issues onto the political agenda, and if we're thinking of it through an electoral standpoint, sometimes to reshape or to shape politics and elections themselves. So let's think, why do people in a democracy protest? Let's start with this really this basic question. If democracy already provides elections, if we already vote in a democracy, if that's how we can make our voice heard by electing people to represent us in a representative democracy, why protest? So the answer then is that democracy is more than just voting every few years. It's about voices. It's about your voice and the voice of the American people, the voice of the people in a democracy. Citizens making their demands heard, making sure their voice is heard. Protest is one of the most visible ways to express grievances of those in charge about policies being implemented or enacted. So people protest for many reasons. Maybe it's policy grievances, when people feel government policies are unjust or harmful. For example, the civil rights activists in the 1960s protested segregation and discriminatory laws. Maybe it's about unmet expectations, when people believe democracy has promised rights or benefits that aren't being delivered or that weren't delivered. The women's suffrage movement fought for inclusion in the democratic process itself. So people are mad about unmet expectations. Maybe about moral urgency, when an issue is seen not just not as a matter of preference, but as a fundamental injustice, such as protests against perceived police brutality in recent years, as people brought up in class. And sometimes it's about visibility. Between large-scale protests, these show a sign that grievances are widely shared, not just an individual complaint. So if enough people are frustrated about something, they can take to the streets, and then it brings attention to this issue in a way that maybe if you or I, just a couple of us, were frustrated, wouldn't be able to bring the same grievances to the forefront. So when we think, are movements successful? Are they successful or not successful? We know that not all protests succeed in what they try to achieve, or to bring about long-term change. Because we see and we know that not all change happens overnight. Most public policy, most electoral changes take time to come about. So, okay, so let's think about maybe why some movements would be successful. Are they big or small? The larger and more sustained the movement, the harder it is for leaders to ignore. Think about the size of the 1963 March on Washington. I'm sure we've all seen pictures of it in textbooks as we've worked our way through school. Numbers, how many participants are there? Are there a lot? Do they stick around for a while? So Occupy Wall Street was another example. Where was a decent sized group, not super large, but they stayed around for a while, making their voice heard. Why else might there be success? Well, what's organization and leadership look like? Is there effective coordination that helps maintain movement? The civil rights movement had strong leaders like MLK Jr. and organizations like the NAACP, which helped organize the movements in a way that helped sustain them. Also, we see other clear goals. Oftentimes, successful movements have pretty specific demands. For example, the marriage equality movement focused on legal recognition of same-sex marriage. When people look at the movement, do they know what that movement is trying to do to be successful? Or are they just demonstrating against the government? So are there clear goals within that movement? Something that sociologists and scholars of social movements point to are what are considered political opportunities. Sometimes movements succeed because the political environment is open to change. Like when politicians see a chance to gain support by endorsing the movement's demands. Here, this plays a big role in electoral politics. Do politicians see a chance to gain support from endorsing or being a part of or seeming to endorse the movement's demands? Maybe that can propel a politician onto the global stage. Maybe it can propel a politician wanting to be elected official to office. So this idea of political opportunities, do movements succeed? Does the political environment that exists welcome the movement? And when we think about how issues are framed, how a movement defies its causes also matter. If it connects grievances to broader democratic ideas, it tends to resonate more strongly with average, getting more people on board. So if a movement can have these components to be successful, why might they fail? So usually when we talk about why movements fail in authoritarian regimes and non-democracies, it might be like repression. Government may crack down, discourage participation. In a democracy, we don't see this as much. If we were talking about protests in an authoritarian regime, we would see more crackdown. In democracies where protests are seemingly part of the democratic process, we see less repression. But what we do see is divisions within the movement can really cause the movement to become stagnant or disappear. Is there fragmentation within the protest movement? Are the goals unrealistic? To be frank, are they overly broad and unrealistic? When demands are unclear, so we talked about clear demands for success, are demands unclear? Can politicians ignore them? Can they deflect them? Can they talk about that the demands from the protesters are simply unrealistic and this isn't going to work? And maybe based in that and rooted in that is this loss of public support. If protests turn violent, or disruptive in ways that alienate the public, momentum can certainly collapse from the movement. Okay, so we see why protests matter, how they are a piece of the democratic society, how they can be successful and at times unsuccessful. Let's think for a few moments about how protest movements impact electoral politics. So, even if, as we talked about, even if movements don't achieve all of their goals, and they don't change politics overnight, and the government doesn't change their ways the next day, they oftentimes do change politics in the long run. First, these movements can shape party platforms and shape political agendas. Politicians respond to protests because they signal that an issue has some electoral weight behind it. It matters to people. For example, Black Lives Matter protests made racial justice and police reform central issues to the 2020 Democratic primaries. Second, protests can and may mobilize new voters. People who participate in protests are often more likely to vote afterwards. We see the empirical evidence for this, seeing their engagement as part of a broader civic duty. The civil rights movement not only fought segregation, but also fueled voter registration drives in the South. So third, movements can shift partisan alignments. The Tea Party after 2009 helped transform the Republican Party, pushing it towards a platform of stronger anti-taxation, anti-government platforms. So we see that there is a shift in parties after protest movements. Fourth, protests can even influence candidate emergence. Politicians sometimes build their cases by aligning with or opposing protest movements. Barack Obama's early opposition to the Iraq War gave him credibility with anti-war voters in 2008. So again, even if a protest doesn't necessarily change government policy the next day, or cause government to change its policy the next week, we see how protest movements do actually shape governing policy and electoral politics just in a more expansive time frame. So then let's think for a couple minutes about how protest movements positively and seemingly negatively impact elections. So the influence of protests on elections is kind of complex. It is hard to pinpoint and narrow down what variables have an impact on elections. But there are a few things that we can point to that seemingly make a difference. Protests absolutely raise awareness and put neglected issues onto the national agenda. When a lot of people are demonstrating against or for something, it gets news. It's on our social media. Our friends are talking about. We are being exposed in a way that these issues that maybe we hadn't thought about before, or if they don't really impact our lives, we don't think about them. Now they are on the national agenda, the local agenda, and with our own lives, we are hearing these things discussed. They may energize young voters and underrepresented groups. For example, student-led climate protests have made climate change a priority for many young voters. They see that their peers, their colleagues are demonstrating for something. They hear these discussions and it has an impact. They can also unify a coalition. The women's suffrage movement ultimately led to the 19th Amendment, permanently reshaping the electorate. But we also know that protests can, at times, be pretty polarizing when movements are seen as too radical or threatening to maybe the status quo. They may push moderates towards the opposing party. So from the electoral standpoint, candidates, political parties are worried about it. Is it pushing people away from the party, pushing people towards the other side. And in elections, that of course matters. So, of course, violent or disruptive tactics can backfire. The protests around the 1968 Democratic National Convention created images of chaos that hurt Democrats in the general election. Movements may unintentionally strengthen their opponents. For instance, anti-immigration protests can fuel mobilization on both sides, but sometimes benefit candidates who run on law and order. So, this, again, plays a role in electoral politics. So, in short, protests don't always help the candidates who seem most aligned with them. The impacts depend on timing, framing, public opinion, and the broader political and environment. So then we can ask ourselves, why do people protest in a democracy when they could just vote every 2 years or vote every 4 years? Because voting alone doesn't always give citizens a strong enough voice. At times, protests succeed or fail, and oftentimes it's based on size, on how much organization they can have, goals, and of course the political climate. They do shape electoral politics by influencing parties, mobilizing voters, and reshaping coalitions. And they can both help and hurt electoral outcomes, sometimes in surprising ways that we don't see until the election. So the bigger issue that ties many of our readings together is that democracy is not just about elections. It's an ongoing struggle over ideas, rights, and power. Protest movements are one of the clearest ways ordinary citizens and ordinary people can shape that struggle. Okay, so if you watched to the end, thank you. I try to keep these under 20, but kept this one at 17, so I think we did pretty good. Okay, thank you.